The episode of the barrel, the police had brought a cab along, and in it I accompanied Miss Morstan back to her home. True to the angelic nature of women, she had faced adversity with a composed exterior as long as there was someone weaker than herself to lean on. I had noticed her bright and calm demeanor next to the frightened housekeeper. However, once in the cab, she first appeared faint, and then succumbed to tears, overwhelmed by the trials of the night. She later confided that she had perceived me as cold and distant during the journey. Little did she know the turmoil raging within me, and the effort it took to maintain my composure. My feelings and affection for her surged, just as my hand had in the garden. Years of societal norms could not teach me to appreciate her sweet, brave spirit as fully as this one day of bizarre events had. Yet, two thoughts held me back from expressing my feelings. She was vulnerable and shaken, both mentally and emotionally. To profess my love at such a time would be to take advantage of her fragility. Even more troubling was her wealth. If Holmes's investigations were successful, she would become an heiress. I could not bear the idea that she might regard me as a mere opportunist seeking fortune. The treasure from Agra loomed like an insurmountable barrier between us. We arrived at Mrs. Cecil Forrester's house just before 2 o'clock. The servants had turned in for the night, but Mrs. Forrester, intrigued by the peculiar message Miss Morstan had received, had stayed up, hoping for her return. She opened the door herself, a middle-aged, graceful woman, and I felt a sense of joy as I observed how tenderly she wrapped her arm around Miss Morstan's waist, greeting her in a motherly tone. It was evident that she was no ordinary paid servant, but rather a valued friend. After the introduction, Mrs. Forrester implored me to come in and recount our adventures. I explained the significance of my errand, promising to return and update her on any developments in the case. As we drove away, I cast a glance back, and the image of that little group on the doorstep remained with me. The two graceful figures, the partially open door, the hall light filtering through stained glass, the barometer, and the gleaming stair rods. It was comforting to catch that fleeting glimpse of a serene English home amidst the tumultuous, dark events that had consumed us. The more I contemplated what had transpired, the darker and wilder it seemed. As I rattled through the quiet, gaslit streets, I reviewed the entire extraordinary series of events. The original problem was now fairly clear: the death of Captain Morstan, the pearls that had been sent, the advertisement, the advertisement, the letter we had illuminated all those occurrences. Yet they only led us deeper into a far more tragic mystery. The Indian treasure, the peculiar plan discovered among Morstan's belongings, the bizarre scene at Major Sholto's death, the rediscovery of the treasure immediately followed by the murder of the discoverer, the unusual details surrounding the crime, the footprints, the distinctive weapons, the words on a card that matched those on Captain Morstan's map. Pinchin Lane was a row of shabby two-story brick houses in the lower quarter of Lambeth. I had had to knock for quite some time at No. 3 before making any impression. At last I saw the flicker of a candle behind the blind, and a face appeared at the upper window. The face shouted at me to leave, warning that if I continued making noise, he would unleash his 43 dogs on me. I replied that if he let one out, it was precisely what I had come for. The voice barked again, declaring that he had a wiper in the bag and threatened to drop it on my head if I didn't leave. I insisted that I wanted a dog, but Mr. Sherman would not be persuaded, and told me to stand clear as he was about to drop the wiper. I began to mention Sherlock Holmes's name, and to my surprise, the window immediately slammed shut. Within a minute, the door was unbarred and opened. Mr. Sherman turned out to be a lanky, lean old man with stooping shoulders, a stringy neck, and blue-tinted glasses. He welcomed me, stating that a friend of Sherlock Holmes was always welcome. He advised me to watch out for the badger, which bites. He then reassured me that a slow worm wouldn't harm me, as it had no fangs, and helped keep the beetles in check. He apologized for his initial brusqueness, explaining that he was often mocked by children, and that many came down the lane just to annoy him. He inquired about what Mr. Sherlock Holmes wanted. I informed him that Holmes was looking for one of his dogs. "Ah, that would be Toby," he replied. I confirmed that was indeed the name. Mr. Sherman informed me that Toby lived at No. 7 on the left. He slowly moved forward with his candle, revealing the eccentric collection of animals he had gathered. In the dim, shadowy light, I noticed gleaming eyes peeking down at us from every nook and cranny, while solemn fowls roosting in the rafters shifted lazily as our voices disturbed their slumber. Toby proved to be an unattractive, long-haired, lop-eared creature, a mix of spaniel and lurcher, brown and white in color, with a rather awkward waddling gait. After some hesitation, he accepted a lump of sugar that the old naturalist offered me, and having established an alliance, he followed me to the cab without protest. It was just striking 3 on the palace clock when I found myself back at Pondicherry Lodge. I learned that the former prize-fighter McMurdo had been arrested as an accomplice, and both he and Mr. Sholto had been taken to the station. 2 constables guarded the narrow gate, but allowed me to pass with the dog upon my mention of the detective's name. Holmes was standing on the doorstep with his hands in his pockets, smoking his pipe. He exclaimed that I had brought the dog. He then noted that Athelney Jones had left, and that there had been a tremendous flurry of activity since my departure. He mentioned that not only had friend Thaddeus been arrested, but also the gatekeeper, the housekeeper, and the Indian servant. The place was now ours, except for a sergeant stationed upstairs. He instructed me to leave the dog behind and come up. We secured Toby to the hall table and ascended the stairs. The room was as he had left it, except that a sheet covered the central figure. A weary-looking police sergeant was reclining in the corner. Holmes requested the sergeant's bull's-eye and had me tie a piece of card around his neck so it hung in front of him. After thanking the sergeant, he proceeded to remove his boots and stockings, asking me to carry them down for him, as he intended to do some climbing. He then dipped his handkerchief into the creosote and told me to join him in the garret for a moment. We clambered up through the hole, and Holmes directed the light onto the footprints in the dust. He urged me to pay particular attention to the footprints, asking if I noticed anything significant about them. I observed that they belonged to a child or a small woman. He pressed for more than just their size. Was there nothing else? I remarked that they seemed much like other footprints. Holmes corrected me, pointing out that the print of a right foot in the dust was different from his own naked foot placed beside it. He asked what the primary difference was. I noted that my toes were cramped together, while the other print had each toe distinctly separated. "Exactly," he affirmed. "That is the key. Keep that in mind. Now, would you kindly step over to that flap window and smell the edge of the woodwork? I will remain here since I have this handkerchief in my hand." I complied with his instruction and was immediately aware of a strong tarry odor. Holmes explained that this was where the individual had placed his foot while exiting. He suggested that if I could trace him, Toby would have no trouble following. He instructed me to run downstairs, release the dog, and watch for Blondin. By the time I emerged into the grounds, Sherlock Holmes was already on the roof, and I could see him like a giant glowworm crawling slowly along the ridges. He disappeared behind a stack of chimneys, but soon reappeared before vanishing again on the opposite side. When I made my way around, I found him seated at one of the corner eaves. He called out to confirm it was me. I responded affirmatively. He pointed out a black object below, asking what it was. I informed him it was a water barrel. He inquired whether it had a top. I confirmed it did. He expressed frustration at the prospect of it being a dangerous place, noting that he should be able to descend where the other could climb up. He tested the water pipe and declared it felt sturdy, then decided to proceed. There was a scuffle of feet, and the lantern began its steady descent down the wall. With a light leap, he landed on the barrel, and then onto the ground. It was easy to follow him, he remarked, as he donned his stockings and boots. Tiles were loosened all the way, and in his haste he dropped this bunto. He held up an object to show me, which confirmed his assessment. The item was a small pouch woven from colored grasses, adorned with gaudy beads, resembling a cigarette case. Inside were several spines of dark wood, sharp at one end and rounded at the other, similar to the one that had struck Bartholomew Sholto. "They're dangerous things," he warned. "Be careful not to prick yourself. I'm pleased to have them. Chances are they are all he possesses. There is less risk of either of us finding one in our skin in the near future. I'd prefer to face a martini bullet myself. Are you up for a 6-mile trek, Watson?" I assured him I was. He asked about my leg's condition. I confirmed it was fine. "Here you are, good doggy. Toby, smell it." He held the creosote handkerchief under the dog's nose, while the creature stood with his fluffy legs apart, tilting his head comically as if savoring a fine vintage. Holmes then tossed the handkerchief away, secured a sturdy cord to the mongrel's collar, and led him to the foot of the water barrel. The dog immediately burst into high, excited yelps, and, with his nose to the ground and tail raised, took off on the trail at a pace that strained his leash and kept us running to keep up. The dawn was gradually lightening the eastern sky, allowing us to see further in the cold gray light. The square, imposing house loomed behind us, its black empty windows and stark walls appearing sorrowful and desolate. Our path led directly across the grounds, weaving through the trenches and pits that marred the landscape. The entire area, dotted with scattered dirt heaps and scraggly shrubs, bore a blighted, foreboding look that mirrored the dark tragedy hanging over it. Upon reaching the boundary wall, Toby ran eagerly underneath its shadow before finally stopping in a corner concealed by a young beech tree. Where the two walls met, several bricks had been loosened, and the worn crevices below suggested frequent use as a ladder. Holmes climbed up, and taking the dog from me, dropped him over to the other side. He noted the imprint of a wooden leg's hand, pointing out the slight smear of blood on the white plaster. He expressed relief that there had been no heavy rain since the previous day, as the scent would linger on the road despite their 28-hour head start. I had my doubts considering the heavy traffic that must have passed along the London road in that time. However, my concerns quickly faded. Toby did not hesitate or stray, waddling forward in his distinctive rolling manner. Clearly, the strong scent of the creosote overpowered all other competing smells. "Do not think," Holmes remarked, "that I rely solely on the chance of one of these individuals having stepped in the chemical for my success in this case. I possess knowledge that would allow me to trace them in various ways. Nonetheless, this is the most straightforward method, and given that fortune has placed it in our hands, I would be remiss to overlook it. However, it has prevented the case from becoming the neat little intellectual puzzle it once promised to be. There might have been some credit to gain from it, but for this too evident clue." "There is credit, and plenty of it," I interjected. "I assure you, Holmes, I am astounded at the means by which you achieve your results in this case, even more so than in the Jefferson Hope murder. This seems deeper and more inexplicable. For instance, how could you so confidently describe the wooden-legged man?" He dismissed my admiration, stating it was all quite simple. He did not wish to be theatrical, insisting that it was all clear and straightforward. He explained that 2 officers commanding a convict guard had learned of a significant secret regarding buried treasure. An Englishman named Jonathan Small had drawn a map for them, a name I recalled from the chart in Captain Morstan's possession, where he had signed on behalf of himself and his associates the sign of the 4, as he dramatically referred to it. One of the officers, aided by this chart, obtained the treasure and brought it back to England, presumably leaving behind some condition that was unmet. He asked why Jonathan Small didn't retrieve the treasure himself. The answer was evident, he explained. The chart was dated from a time when Morstan was closely associated with convicts. Jonathan Small could not claim the treasure because he and his accomplices were convicts themselves and unable to escape. But that is mere speculation, I contended. It is more than that. It is the only theory that accounts for the facts. Let's see how it aligns with what followed. Major Sholto lived in peace for several years, content with his treasure, until he received a letter from India that terrified him. What could that have been? A letter informing him that the men he had wronged were released, or perhaps escaped. That is far more likely, as he would be aware of their sentence. What did he do next? He took precautions against a wooden-legged man, white man, mind you, mistaking a white tradesman for him and even firing a pistol at him. Only one white man's name appears on the chart. The others are Hindus or Muslims. Therefore, we can confidently say that the wooden-legged man is indeed Jonathan Small. Does this reasoning seem flawed to you? No, it is clear and succinct. Now, let's place ourselves in Jonathan Small's shoes. Let's consider it from his perspective. He arrives in England with the dual purpose of reclaiming what he sees as his rights and seeking revenge against the man who wronged him. He discovers where Sholto lives and likely establishes communication with someone inside the house. There is the butler, Lal Rao, whom we have yet to meet. Mrs. Burnstone does not speak highly of him. Small, however, could not ascertain where the treasure was hidden, as only the major and one loyal servant, now deceased, knew the location. Suddenly, Small learns that the major is on his deathbed. In a frenzy, fearing that the secret of the treasure would die with him, he braves the guards, approaches the dying man's window, and is only deterred from entering by the presence of the man's two sons. Consumed by hatred, he enters the room that night, searching through the major's private papers for any notes about the treasure, and ultimately leaves a memento of his visit with the inscription on the card. It seems he had premeditated that if he were to kill the major, he would leave some sign that this was not a common murder, but an act of justice from the perspective of the four associates. Such whimsical and bizarre ideas are not uncommon in criminal history and usually provide valuable clues about the perpetrator. Are you following all of this? Very clearly. Now, what could Jonathan Small do? He could only maintain a secret watch on the efforts to locate the treasure. He might leave England and return intermittently. Then came the discovery of the garret, and he learned of it immediately. We can again trace the presence of a confederate in the household. Jonathan, with his wooden leg, could not access Bartholomew Sholto's high room. However, he brought along a rather unusual associate who was able to overcome this obstacle, but, in doing so, left his naked foot in creosote, leading us to Toby and a 6-mile limp for a half-pay officer with a damaged Achilles tendon. But it was the associate, not Jonathan, who committed the crime. Precisely. And it seemed to be to Jonathan's dismay, judging by how he stomped about upon entering the room. He bore no animosity toward Bartholomew Sholto, and would have preferred to simply bind and gag him. He had no wish to face the gallows. However, he was left with no choice. The savage instincts of his companion took over, and the poison had done its work. Thus, Jonathan Small left his mark, lowered the treasure box to the ground, and followed it himself. That's the chain of events as far as I can decipher. Regarding his appearance, he must be middle-aged and sunburned from his time in the sweltering heat of the Andaments. His height can be inferred from the length of his stride, and we know he had a beard. His hairiness was the one detail that struck Thaddeus Sholto when he saw him at the window. I believe that covers everything. What about the associate? Ah, well, there's nothing particularly mysterious about that. But you'll learn all about it soon enough. How sweet the morning air is. Look at that little cloud floating like a pink feather from some enormous flamingo. Now the sun's red rim is breaking over the London cloud bank. It shines on many people, but I dare say none are on a stranger errand than you and I. How small we feel with our petty ambitions in the face of nature's grand elemental forces. Are you familiar with Jean-Paul? Fairly so. I traced my way back to him through Carlisle. That's akin to following the brook to its parent lake. He makes a curious yet profound observation. The principal proof of man's true greatness lies in his recognition of his own smallness. It suggests a capacity for comparison and appreciation that itself indicates nobility. Richter offers much food for thought. You don't have a pistol, do you? I only have my stick. It's quite possible we might need something like that if we find ourselves at their hideout. I shall leave Jonathan to you, but if the other turns hostile, I'll shoot him dead. He retrieved his revolver, loaded 2 chambers, and returned it to his jacket pocket. During this time, we had been following Toby down the half-rural, villa-lined roads leading towards the city. As we approached continuous streets, laborers and dock workers were already beginning their day, while slovenly women took down shutters and swept doorsteps. At the square-topped corner pubs, business was just commencing, and rough-looking men emerged, wiping their sleeves across their beards after their morning drinks. Strange dogs sauntered up, gazing curiously at us as we passed, but our unique Toby paid no heed, trotting onwards with his nose to the ground and occasionally letting out an eager whine that hinted at a promising scent. We traversed Streatham, Brixton, Camberwell, and now found ourselves in Kennington Lane, having veered east through the side streets near the Oval. The men we followed seemed to have taken a curiously zigzag route, likely to avoid detection. They never stuck to the main road if a parallel side street would suffice. At the foot of Kennington Lane, they turned left through Bond Street and Miles Street. When we reached the point where Miles Street turns into Knight's Place, Toby halted, running back and forth with one ear perked and the other drooping, embodying canine indecision. Then he circled around, looking up at us occasionally, as if seeking our support in his uncertainty. Holmes grumbled about the dog's strange behavior, questioning whether they would have taken a cab or flown away in a balloon. I suggested that perhaps they had lingered there for a while. Holmes reassured me that everything was fine, as Toby was off again. Indeed, he was off, having sniffed around once more before suddenly making a decision and darting away with newfound energy and determination. The scent seemed much stronger than before, as he didn't even need to place his nose on the ground, but tugged at his leash, eager to break into a run. I could see the gleam in Holmes's eyes, indicating that he believed we were nearing the end of our pursuit. Our path led us down 9 Elms until we reached Broderick and Nelson's large timber yard, just past the White Eagle Tavern. Here, the dog, brimming with excitement, veered through a side gate into the yard, where the sawyers were already hard at work. Toby raced through sawdust and shavings, down an alley, around a passage between 2 wood piles, and finally, with a triumphant bark, leaped onto a large barrel, still resting on the hand trolley that had transported it. With his tongue hanging out and eyes blinking, Toby stood atop the cask, looking from one of us to the other for acknowledgment. The staves of the barrel and the trolley wheels were smeared with a dark liquid, and the air was thick with the scent of creosote. Sherlock Holmes and I exchanged blank looks before bursting into uncontrollable laughter.